What's going on, Forceful players? Ryan Miles here with not exactly a daily mileage, just kind of like a free-form vlog where I want to talk about something that I thought about while I was at work today. Wrote this big long post, and it was like kind of turning into a super long essay that I don't even think that many people would read if I did post it. So I'm kind of glad that it actually failed to post, and I can just talk about it here now. The idea kind of spawned from this comment that I saw on Facebook. It says, "Looks like the band This Card Squad found a new card to attack." And I kind of want to talk about the mentality that drives this kind of comment and just kind of hopefully open up your mind if it's a sentiment that you share. You know, the idea that everyone is always looking for a card to ban, the idea that as soon as you ban one card, it's going to go to another card, and therefore we just shouldn't ban any cards because everyone's going to complain about everything. I think this is incorrect, not because it's not true. I think that people are always looking for a card to ban, and sometimes it's justified and sometimes it isn't. But I do think that we are kind of in a place right now where it is justified, and I've usually been a big proponent of when I think cards should be banned, and this happens a lot in Forcible, just because I think that the designers of the cards of Forcible are not very good at balancing the game. They're very good at making fun interactive mechanics. They're very good at making interesting lore and a universe that melts together. But when it comes to actually balancing the game, as a whole, they're okay. But there's usually a couple outliers that are especially egregious that I think you would make the game better overall by banning them swiftly and without prejudice. So, in order to help break down this mindset, and if you do share it, or if you do have this mindset, or you of the comment I posted, and you want to or if you know someone who does, feel free to share them this video because I think this is gonna pose a very interesting philosophical question. And that question that I have is, if there is a card that costs 0 mana, it is a quick cast chant, it is unchaseable, and the card says win the game, should that card be banned? So once again, this is a 0 mana card. It is a quick cast chant with the text, "This card cannot be chased to by players. You win the game." Just as soon as you get a priority sequence, you get to cast this card, your opponent cannot respond, and the game ends, and you've won. Is that card balanced? Is that card fair? Is that card fun to play against? I think the answer to all these is no, and I hope if you're at home watching, I think that you will quickly come to the conclusion that, yeah, no, this card should be banned. So my hypothesis is that every single card in every single card game ever is really just a derivative of this card, with power levels or notches taken down off of it to make it into a playable card. So the way that you would, so just think about from an abstract sense how you would try and balance this card, right? So you have a 0 mana card that just wins the game, and you say, okay, well, clearly winning the game should not be a 0 mana ability. So let's make this card cost 5 mana. Okay, so now I have a 5-will, unchaseable, colorless, quick cast chant that says win the game. Is that still really balanced? No. It's clearly less powerful than the card we started with, but it is still format warping, meta defining, completely unfun to play against. It's got counterplay in the sense that you have discard, you don't really have counter spells, so you can discard it. You have enough time to do that, but anytime your opponent top decks it past turn 5, they're just going to win the game. So clearly that's not enough. So we have to keep attacking the card and bring it down bit by bit until we find a playable outcome, right? So let's say that the way this card, you remove the unchaseable part, okay, so now it can be countered. You make it color identity, so you know at least that when you're playing against a red deck that this is a card in their deck. You have some sort of resource attachment to that. You remove quick cast, so you can't just do it at the end of your opponent's turn when they've tapped out, or before they're untapped if they want to be greedy. You just keep adding on these restrictions, right? And eventually you just make a 7-will, 7 red resonator with a 0/1 stat line and a ability, when this card enters the field, win the game. Or maybe you make it a Regalia, a 7 mana Regalia that you need to remove 7 cards with it to win the game, for example, right? We've actually had that card printed where it was a win condition that was just very, very difficult to obtain. And we've clearly seen this card with the text, "You win the game," go from completely game-breakingly overpowered down to something where it never even saw competitive play. So clearly there are steps you can take to take a idea and then reduce its power level down to something that not only makes it balanced, but can even make it bad or just not even competitively viable at all. So the idea that you can balance something from this card, I think, can be, like I said, applied to every single card. So let's, instead of saying that this card says win the game, it just says 0 mana, void, quick cast chant, unchaseable, says your opponent does not get a recovery step for the rest of the game. That is clearly worse than the original card. You do not, instead of winning the game on the spot, your opponent just doesn't recover for the rest of the game. Functionally, the cards are identical. When you resolve that card, you probably win 99 out of 100 games, But say, for example, you don't draw that card until turn 4, and your opponent has put down enough Resonator that they can actually kill you with combat on board. That is a situation where this card, where they are skipping and they're untapped for the rest of the game, instead of just you winning on the spot, is actually worse. Let's say the card says deal 8,000 damage to your opponent, 0 will, unchaseable, etc., etc. It's just that card, it still basically says win the game, except for the situations where it doesn't. So, again, this is something that is just reducing the power level of this card in a notch, but it's still functionally the same. But as you change it in that way, as you make it deal 8,000 damage, and you say, okay, this card is effectively the same, it's still bannable. Okay, well now the card is 0 mana and says deal 4,000 damage. Is it still bannable? Absolutely. The card says deal 2,000 damage. It's still bannable? Absolutely. Okay, the card says deal 500 damage. 0 mana, 500 damage, unchaseable. I think that's kind of dumb, but we're getting a lot, it's clearly less broken than the card that we started with, and we've still got so many different things packed into it. So once you start assigning costs to it, once you start removing adding restrictions to it, or removing benefits like the unchaseable part, you get a different card, but you're still devolving it from that base original card. So in the case of Distortion of Time, right? We have this card that's got a God Art that says 3 mana, your opponent skips an untap step. The way that you would derive Distortion of Time from this card is you would say, okay, well, make it cost 1 blue will, and then make it so your opponent doesn't untap for the rest of the game, and then make it so, your opponent only doesn't untap for 2 turns. Oh, that's still too broken. Make it so your opponent doesn't untap for 1 turn, and then make it so you can only activate this ability once per game. You're taking the base card and just taking steps off of it to get to where we're at. So if every card can be derived from this Omega card, right? How many steps away? There is a process by which you get to any single card, right? And I just described Distortion of Time, how you get from there to here. Or with the example where you say it deals 8,000 damage, it deals 4,000 damage, it deals 500 damage, instead of costing 0 will, it costs 1 red will, instead of being unchaseable, it's chaseable, I just turned this card into Thunder in 4 easy steps, right? And no one would say that Thunder's a bannable card, but there's probably a card along the iteration, along those steps getting there, that you would say is still bannable. There's a point, there's a line you have to cross to get where the card is overpowered beyond playability, and it's not a card you actually want in the game, to the point where the card is acceptable and is within the power level of every other card in the game. So the idea that there should never be banned cards is wrong, because that assumes that the company will never print a card that is 0 mana quick castville. They'll never print an Omega card, right? It's gonna arbitrarily call it that for the rest of the game, or the rest of the video. So you have to assume that the company is not going to print an Omega card. I think that's a flawed assumption, because people, the developers are human. People will make mistakes. Sometimes they seem very obvious to the competitive players right away. Sometimes they're more nuanced, and it actually takes a couple repetitions of players going through the decks to really figure out when something is egregiously overpowered. If you think about Scheherazade, Scheherazade wasn't really, railed against at the outset, because it actually took, competitive players who play this game all the time and are constantly looking for ways to break the game. It took them a month, I want to say, a couple weeks to actually figure out that, Scheherazade has some really intricate interactions that are just completely more powerful than anything else. And if you think about how the design team is probably only 10 people, and their really core job is to make a game fun and enjoyable, their primary job is not balance. It is once they have the set designed, okay, then make everything balance. So if it takes competitive players a month to break that, I think it's unreasonable to expect a design team to catch everything. It's just not. Even in Magic, there are cards that get banned all the time, right? So there is a possibility that we can design a card that should be banned, and then from that card we can derive almost any other card in the game just by assigning restrictions, removing restrictions, assigning effects, etc., etc. If you wanted to make a Resonator out of this card, for example, it would be a Resonator with it would be a 0 mana 4,000 Resonator. Is that playable, or is that bannable? I would think so. And you just take an obscenely overpowered card to the point where you'd say, yes, this card needs to be banned, and then you just tone it down bit by bit. Oops, sorry. Wrong. There we go. So here's an image. If you're just listening along, it's not a big deal. So here we have a kind of scale from 1 to 10. Let's actually go ahead and put some numbers on here, right? That's not. God dang it. Alright, so I'm very prepared for this video, everybody. How does I don't understand. All right. There we go. All right, so from 1 to 10, you've got these cards, right? A 1 would be a completely unplayable card. I have here pictured Unstable Golem. It's an absolutely wildly unplayable Golem card from the Pandora set. It came out in 80k. You don't need to worry about it. And then over on the 10 scale, we have this mystery 0 mana, just win the game card, right? This is the most powerful thing that could exist in Force of Will, or any game really. It's just the Omega card. And then somewhere on that scale, we have the relative playability of everything else. So I think Distortion of Time kind of falls maybe around like a 4.5. It's really like arbitrary numbers that I'm throwing out here, but I think a Distortion of Time is a much less powerful card than, for example, Reincarnated Maiden of Flame Prisia, who kind of defined it for a format and just has. I would say that Prisia is farther removed, or is less far removed from the Omega card than Distortion of Time is. I think you would need to make more fixes to bring Prisia into playability than you would need to make to Distortion of Time. So when you're bringing this Omega card down from its 10 status and trying to bring it down to wherever the level of the relative power level of the format is, you just kind of do it in notches. And I think that there is, in any given format, a generic power level that exists. Like, for example, I think right now New Frontiers is the average power level of cards is much less powerful than it was during the Prisia era and the Fox meta, because in the Prisia meta you had Fox, you had Tree 2, you had Lumia, you had Captain Hook, you had a lot of very powerful cards, and right now the lack of dual stones contributes a lot. We have less powerful removal. Nothing is as good now as Space Time Anomaly was then, and Space Time Anomaly was only good in control decks back then. So it definitely like depends on the power level of the format, but like you're still taking this Omega card and you're reducing the power level down to whatever the power level of the format is. And because we can agree that there is a card that exists, the Omega card, that is always going to be too powerful, there are always steps to take to get that card down to a playable level, and there are iterations along the way. Say that Distortion of Time is a 4 out of 10, right? In complete total, it's just that's the objective power level of the card. I'm trying to like draw some art here, and I'm completely failing. So say that Distortion of Time is a 4 out of 10. There is a version of Distortion of Time that is a 6 out of 10. That maybe Distortion of Time costs 1 mana to activate the God Art. Maybe it's not a God Art at all. I think this card would be bannable, and that would probably be more around the Prisia level. It would be around like a 6 out of 10, maybe even a 7 out of 10. My point is there are more powerful versions of Distortion of Time that could have existed that would be bannable. At the same time, I think there are less powerful versions of Distortion of Time that could exist that would not be bannable. For example, if Chrono Break cost 5 mana and it was all blue mana, that would definitely make it a much less playable card. If Distortion of Time didn't draw a card, like if it just looked at the top card of your deck and then didn't draw a card, that would be slightly less powerful. Instead of like a 4, it might be like a 3.5. Just these are arbitrary numbers once again. I think when you like add these restrictions, you're continuing to decrease the power level of the card. And some versions of that card would still be, in my opinion, bannable, and some wouldn't. But the idea is that right now we have this version of Distortion of Time, we have this version of Lorite, we had this version of Prisia, we had this version of Captain Hook, we have this version of Fox that are just cards that you don't need to take at face value. They're cards that you need to say, okay, what could they have been? What would a more powerful version of that card be? And what would a less powerful version of that card be? And I think that Distortion of Time as it exists is a card that is higher up on the power level than the rest of the format, and therefore has not yet crossed the line of being weakened enough to be a card that would not be bannable. And I guess kind of pretty much the only point I'm trying to make is that in this like infinite like multiverse, right, of Omega card to unplayable card, there's infinite versions of what Distortion of Time could have been, and there's infinite versions of what every card could have been. That's just the nature of card games. And then whatever the developers decide to pick out of that lineup and say this is the card we're going to print, just because a card exists does not mean that it is immune from criticism or that it is completely off the table as to say, people just need to get good. This card is clearly, by existing, not bannable, and everyone just wants to ban something. No, I think that that cards are bannable because because of this system I've described, where you're always looking at the relative power level compared to the format and the relative power level compared to the most overpowered card imaginable. And how far removed something is from that Omega card is kind of just a arbitrary metric that I'm using to describe that. And yeah, I hope that makes sense. Obviously, it's kind of a complicated topic, so please make sure to comment on Facebook, comment in the description. I'd love to talk about it more, and let me know what you think. So thanks, everyone.